From the Zoomerplex in historic Liberty Village, theZoomer, hosted by Marissa Lennox.
Welcome to theZoomer. I'm Marissa Lennox. Christianity is still the world's largest religion, with over 2.5 billion people who call themselves Christian. But in many parts of the world, following that faith comes with a heavy cost. Right now, about 365 million Christians are facing serious persecution or discrimination. Today, we're digging into this reality and what it could mean for the future of religious freedom. Joining me to kick off this discussion is author and Middle East expert Raymond. Ibrahim, Raymond, welcome to the show.
Hello, Marissa. Good to be with you.
Start by telling me about the scale of brutality against Christians globally.
It's pretty significant, as those statistics indicate from the Open Doors World Watch List. Annually, every year, something like 365 or even more, sometimes Christians are reported as being persecuted. And this is serious persecution. This isn't, the war on Christmas sort of thing that we're familiar with in the West. It's actual attacks, violence, rapes. Sometimes the authorities themselves get in on it in the context of blasphemy codes, apostasy codes, etc., strictures against church buildings or repairs, etc., etc. But such as it is, you do not hear about it at all in the West, except when it's a very spectacular attack, a church bombing where dozens die. That will be reported, and then it will be presented as an aberration. But it's really the tip of the iceberg of a much more horrific form and sometimes subtle form of persecution that goes on underneath.
Well, the persecution is happening all over in many regions around the world. Where are the most severe cases? Like, is there any particular country where it's especially brutal for Christians?
Well, we can start off by saying that, and going back to the World Watch List, which reports the 50 worst nations to be a Christian in, habitually something like 37 or 38, if you count them, are Muslim, or at least Islam is the source of the animosity and the persecution. So, for example, in Nigeria, it's half Muslim, half Christian. Muslims are essentially committing a genocide, and that's the word a lot of other people have used, people in the know. But aside from the fact that Islam in general takes a lion's share of the persecution of Christians, it's especially horrific in sub-Saharan Africa. It is a full-on blown genocidal jihad in Nigeria, which some people may be aware of, but it's all throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Mozambique, it's happening in Mali, Somalia, Uganda, Burkina Faso most recently. And I'm talking about beheading, burning, slaughtering, the whole nine yards. But if you move out of there into, let's say, the Arab world, you have a more systemic form of persecution, which is actually, it's part of the law. So, for example, Egypt, in its constitution, Article 2 says that the laws of Egypt are based on Sharia, Islamic law. And if they're based on Sharia, then it makes sense what we see. So, for example, Coptic Christians can't build churches. They can't even repair churches. And churches are constantly under attack. So it's more systemic in these nations in the Arab world. Also in Iran, they have an issue with apostates. They don't want people converting to Christianity. But it really spills all over. If you go into Europe, where you have large segments of Muslims, you're going to find Christians being attacked, and churches in Europe are being burned habitually, constantly.
Are there any big human rights organizations that are taking this on as their cause right now?
There's a few NGOs, I would say, that talk about it, but none that are significantly large enough to, make an impact. I often wonder, someone like Pope Francis, historically it was the Catholic Pope who spearheaded the defense of Christians. But you look at him and people like him who are the majority, and he'll send an encyclical about climate change, but he won't send an encyclical about 365 million Christians being persecuted, even though that's his primary job, taking care of his flock.
Why do you think that is?
So no, all I can say is this Pope takes a very, very lenient view against what Muslims are doing. Will never mention it. One time they asked him about Islam and persecution, he yelled and said, well, Catholics in Italy are committing crimes. So what's the difference? And he doesn't understand that, in Islam, it's their scripture is telling them to do this, whereas the Catholics in Italy are going against their scripture. And that's the pivotal point. So.
Okay, Raymond, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
All right, I'm going to bring in someone now whose personal journey adds a profound dimension to our discussion. Majed al-Shafie was born into a prominent Muslim family in Egypt, made the life-altering decision to convert to Christianity. He joins me now for what happened next. Majed, welcome to the program again.
Thank you for having me.
Can you start by telling me about your decision and what transpired after it?
I was age of 18. I was studying in a law school in Alexandria when I start to witness the persecution that's happening to the Christian community in Egypt. And I start to wonder why. Because you don't persecute somebody unless you are scared from the truth that they carry. This is started a research through my best friend, which was a Christian tanner. And I started my own journey researching about the truth of the Bible and the truth of Christ. And in the end of this research, I came to the conclusion that Christ came to die for his own people. Many people will ask me the question, what's really the difference between Islam and Christianity? And there is many difference between 300 to 400. But if we want to put it in one sentence, every king sent his people to die for him, except in Christianity. Our king came to die for us. The message of forgiveness, the sacrifice, is what made me decide to convert to Christianity.
And what challenges did you face at the time?
I was arrested by the Egyptian authority. I was tortured severely underground in Abu Zaban prison. I was hanged upside down. I was burned with cigarettes. I was crucified for 2 days and a half. I was beaten. I was cut by knife in the back of my left shoulder to the bone, and they put salt and lemon in the open wounds. I received the death penalty, and that's when I decided that I have to escape out of Egypt. And I stole a jet ski and I crossed the border to Israel.
I don't even know how to ask this question, but what was that like to face state-sponsored persecution?
It's hell on earth, but I'm not the first and I'm not the last. We have to understand that there is one persecuted Christian every 3 minutes. That's mean from the time we started this show until we end, we have more than a new 100 Christians being persecuted for their faith. The truth here is that I am one of the most blessed ones that I survived to share my story and the testimony. But there is many of us that dies every day and nobody even know of their existence.
You have experienced firsthand the consequences of leaving Islam. In your view, why is it so difficult for Islamic countries, particularly those with Salafi and Wahhabi ideologies, to allow religious diversity? In other words, can they share?
There is no sharing in Islam. Islam, according to the Muslim faith and according to the Sharia law, is the true religion of the world. Let's just put it in a concept. In Surah At-Tawbah in Quran, just for the people to say this is a lie or something, I will prove it within their book. In Surah At-Tawbah, قاتلوا الذين لا يؤمنون بالله ولا باليوم الآخر ولا يحرمون ما حرمه الله ورسوله ولا يدينون دين الحق والذين أوتوا الكتاب حتى يعطوا الجزية وهم صاغرون. That's basically telling you that Islam is the true religion of God and asking them that Muslims to kill us wherever we are if we don't believe in Allah and his messenger Muhammad, or the people of the book, which is the Christians and the Jews, if they want to live with us, they have to pay jizya, which is the kind of form of tax. This is in the Quran. This is not what Majed is saying. That's not what Ibrahim is saying. That's basically what the Quran is saying. It is embedded within the religion. You have to understand that 80% of the persecution that's happening to the Christians today is happening in Muslim countries. The another 20%, you found it in India and communist regimes like China and Cuba and North Korea. But in reality, that even here in our country, Canada, let me just put it since October 7, there is 7 terror attacks that was stopped by our Canadian intelligence. All of them was attacks from Muslims that they came here as an immigrants or in a visa. And they was planning to attack the public in Canada and was planning to attack even in a synagogue in New York.
Majed, I know you're in the Middle East right now, and so I appreciate you taking the time for us today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back with more of the Zoomer. Welcome back. My next guest comes from an Ismaili family, a branch of Shia Islam, and is a prominent columnist here in Canada, often writing about intercultural and interfaith relations. Rahim Mohamed, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Marissa.
First of all, we've been talking about Christianity and Islam and the importance of religious freedom. I want to ask you, as an Ismaili living here in Canada, what your experience has been like as a Muslim living in the West.
It's been overwhelmingly positive. So my community, as you know, has been in Canada for upwards of 50 years, just over 50 years. I cross categories, culture, business, politics. I've always had a number of my fellow Ismailis to look toward as role models. So Canada's first Muslim elected member of Parliament, Rahim, an Ismaili Canadian at present, our Attorney General. Arif Virani, also an Ismaili Canadian. We also have a Supreme Court Justice Jamal. At least he was born Ismaili, has since converted. So I've always felt the Ismaili community has been quite rooted and quite successful in Canada. And we're fortunate to have enjoyed a quite prosperous history here in Canada.
I want to ask you about a shifting landscape of faith and politics in Canada. I know it's something that you've written extensively about. And in a recent publication, you touch on events in particular after October 7th that are being framed within certain Muslim communities. Are you seeing a growing population influencing public policy and discourse here in Canada?
So the Muslim community in Canada is still fairly small. I believe they're just under 5% of the population, according to the last census. So it's not a massive community that can exert its influence at a national level, but Muslim Canadians do, I think, by happenstance, tend to live in parts of the electoral map that are competitive. So you have a good number of Muslims, Arab, South Asian, Somali, etc., in places like the Greater Toronto area, Windsor, London, places that tend to be competitive in the electoral map. So there's a interest group called the Muslim Canadian Vote that has calculated there are enough Muslims to swing the outcome of the election from one candidate to another in about a third of all federal ridings, which is not an overwhelming number, but it's also not nothing. So you are seeing sort of Muslim Canadians, by virtue of where they live, particularly in some of these swing ridings, beginning to be a demographic that is more catered towards.
Can you also share maybe some specific examples of how this influence is manifesting?
So one thing I would say is the Muslim community is not a monolith, and Canada's Muslim community is interesting in that you have a lot of different diasporas reflected within people who call themselves Muslim Canadians. So you have a number of Somali Canadians, a number of Arab Canadians. I myself am South Asian, of Indian descent. And in places like Vancouver, you have a large number of Persians. And there are a good number of Persians who are highly pro-Israel, highly against the Iranian regime, and have been quite in favor of some of the actions that Israel have taken since October the 7th. The protests, unfortunately, that have gotten more of the attention, the anti-Israel protests, the protests that have involved vandalizing Jewish businesses, in a number of instances, shots being fired at Jewish schools. You're seeing this weird alliance of certainly some aspects of Arab Canadians, the Muslim Canadian community, but also the hard left. Also groups like Queers for Palestine, also a lot of sort of the postmodern set on university campuses. So it's a much more complicated story, I think, than just Islam versus Christianity or just Islam versus Israel.
And as this population continues to grow, fast forward 5-10 years from now, what does that look like for Canada, both politically and culturally?
So I think the bigger schism, as opposed to between Christians and Muslims and Jews, will be between secular Canadians and Canadians of faith. So the population in Canada has about doubled since the turn of the 20th century. You now have a third of Canadians who say they're either atheist or agnostic or have no religion. And that is by far and away the fastest growing segment of the population. So I think we'll see Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, other faith communities come together for a number of initiatives like we saw last summer with the parental rights, some of those mobilizations.
Okay, Rahim, Mohamed, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Stick around. We'll be right back. We're back. In 2023, Gallup released a poll which found that belief in God in the U.S. is at an all-time low. Back in 2001, 90% of people believed in God, with 83% believing in heaven. Fast forward to today, and those numbers have dropped to 74% and 67%, respectively. Now, the shift isn't exactly shocking. For decades, we've seen fewer people in the pews and fewer identifying religion as a core part of their lives. Canada is experiencing similar trends. So what is driving this shift? Let's bring in the panel now for their insights. And Father de Souza, I'll begin with you because the numbers are hard to deny. Why is Christianity on its back foot?
Well, it's on its back foot in Canada or the United States, other parts of Western Europe, and other parts of the world. It actually can be quite vibrant and growing. But it could be that a society that's prosperous, technologically advanced, sees less need to rely on anyone else, let alone God. And also there's a kind of compatibility or that in countries in Europe, Ireland, France, Germany, so forth, where the faith is eroded, those same communities in Canada have experienced the same kind of decline in religious observance. And amongst countries in the world where religion is more vibrant, say in the Indian subcontinent, in Africa, those immigrants, when they come to Canada, are also more vibrant. So that's been the decline. One interesting exception to the general decline is that you find pockets, at least in the Catholic experience, of places of unusual vibrancy, sometimes on campus. I've been on campus for most of my priesthood at Queen's University. And there you find, albeit small, a kind of renewal of religious observance.
And among younger people.
Amongst younger people on campus. And usually what's interesting from a kind of sociological perspective is that they tend to be more interested in the tradition of the faith than perhaps that their parents or grandparents would be. So they're more traditional Christians or Catholics.
That's interesting. You know, Christianity is the biggest religion in the world, Reverend Bott, and it's also expected to lose the most followers in the next few decades, and that's from a Pew survey. And so I guess I'm wondering, how is it that the largest religion in the world is also experiencing the largest net loss due to a lack of conversion?
Well, I would follow with what Father de Souza has said, in that, at least within North American Christianity, yes, we're seeing a decline in a general reality, and I'm sure that our colleagues from the academic fields are able to speak into that even more than I am. But part of the reality within my denomination as well is we're seeing growth in individual communities of faith. About 10% of our communities of faith are actually in the process of growth, even as the wider United Church finds itself lessening.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by communities of faith?
So that's the term that we would use in my denomination for congregations or for churches.
So the United Church is seeing some growth?
Yes, we are, absolutely. And a lot of it is in similar kinds of ways to what Father de Souza was saying. We're seeing growth with relationships with folks who are immigrating from a variety of places around the world. We're also seeing growth in certain communities of faith that are, as you were saying, exploring with young adults, exploring the traditions of the church, exploring the possibilities of what that might mean as, and I'm going to say this, as liberal Christians in a North American context, which is where the United Church would come from.
But a lot of people would argue that liberalism is hurting the church.
I wouldn't argue that, actually.
No, I wouldn't either.
Right now, here in Canada, if you look across the panoply of Christian denominations, it's hard to find a Christian denomination that's actually growing, whatever its theology. Baptists are down, and they're certainly conservative. Mm-hmm. Salvation Army, certainly conservative.
But wouldn't you look at
down.
the evangelical church in the United States and say that's one church that's at least holding strong?
They're actually down a bit in the U.S.
Southern Baptists are not doing well.
Nope, not at all.
I mean, I think there's a misconception of what the trends are. There's no denying that here in Canada, Christianity has declined. I mean, in 1961, 97% of the population self-identified as Christian. Today, based on the latest census in 2021, just a few years back, it's just over half the population.
53%.
Yeah, 53%. So clearly, there's been a significant decline. But I don't think theology is the explanation for that decline, because we're seeing it. I mean, even Pentecostals are not doing well in this country.
I mean, there's a lot of kind of structural changes that have gone on in Canada since the 60s that have changed how we do religion in the country, right? Or big chunks of how the population does religion. I mean, things like, the rise or taking off of consumer market economy, so the creation of secular alternatives for different activities, the rise of the welfare state, right? The government taking over a lot of provision of social services that were once done by churches in the sector of health and education. Things like, a diversification of the population since the opening up of immigration in the 60s, a decoupling of national identities with Christian identity in both English-speaking Canada and French-speaking Canada. I mean, this and even more trends are all kind of feeding into this, and that becoming non-religious is now more normal than it used to be and more socially acceptable than it used to be. So it's a choice that a big chunk of the population, about a third of the population, as we heard earlier, now chooses into, to say they have no religion. And so I think I always like to flip the question around a bit, is why were the Christian churches so dominant from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century? Because they really were. They basically ran our society in Canada. But yeah, we've shifted out of that since.
Okay, let's pause for just a moment. We'll be right back with more of the Zoomer. Is there an argument to be made that if the Christian church was more laser-focused on tradition and its beliefs, as, say, Islam is, it might perform better?
Could be. I mean, it's correct, as my colleagues say here, that there's no group that's doing well in terms of growth. But to your original question, it's my view, liberal Christianity is doing much worse than what you might call conservative Christianity. Those are not the most ideal terms. But where there are pockets of growth, you could call it laser focused or more faithful to the tradition, that's where you're seeing there's two parts of growth in the Christian world in Canada. It's in immigrant communities, which are, we might say, the cultural, ethnic basis. But if it's not a cultural, ethnic basis, then it's going to be fidelity to the tradition, which would be called more conservative. So, I mean, one of the biggest news stories of the last 2 years, Christian news stories, is the Archbishop of Canterbury in 2023 lost the majority of his congregation. The majority of Anglicans in the world no longer recognize him because he's too liberal. That's a big liberal decline of Christianity story. Where is the Anglican Church growing, both here or in the world, is in Africa, which is the more conservative churches. Now, in the Catholic world, we don't have quite the same setup, but in those countries where there's a more liberal, say, accommodationist point of view, for example, in Germany, the numbers are hemorrhaging. And those places where there's more fidelity to our tradition, it's not growth, as was pointed out, but there's actually pockets of vitality there.
How about that?
I think where I might disagree with my brother here is that it's fidelity to the faith. And how you, from the tradition you come from, how you might interpret the faith and how I might interpret the faith may very well be different understandings of that. And what we're finding is that when we are being laser focused on what it means to be a disciple of Jesus in this time and place, with our understanding around what the great commandment is and how we live out that love for neighbor and self and God together, we're finding that if we are laser focused on that living, whether it's supportive to us LGBTQA folks, whether it is in conversation with Indigenous communities and recognizing the brokenness of relationship and how we need to work to build that here in Canada, if we are living out our faith faithfully in that, that's where we're seeing people come to take part. So where I would only disagree with you there is it the traditions of the faith, or is it the faith itself that's bringing people together?
I don't doubt that the Archbishop of Canterbury or the United Church and their view of liberal Christianity is being sincere and faithful. I don't doubt that. Sure. It's just that they're not having as many followers or disciples as those places that would offer according to them, a more fidelity to tradition. Okay. And the Anglican Church is just, I mean, it's more dramatic because he lost 2/3 of his flock. Biggest news story the last 2 years in Christianity, global Christianity. But it's not an Anglican only, it's just more dramatic there. In the Catholic Church, we would say the same thing. In those countries where there is a more desire to accommodate to a liberal culture, the churches does worse.
Let me ask you something, because you've just listed a number of things that are very inherently political. Mm-hmm. So, you know, what's the reason for that, the motivation for that, over, say, focusing solely on theology and on morals and values?
Jesus was inherently political. And so if the person for whom we turn to for our guidance in faith was prepared to challenge empire, then we need to be prepared to do that both within who we are and in the wider community. So I'd like to suggest that for all of Christianity, anyone who's living within a cultural context, we are going to be political because we live in the world. We're going to have conversations about what the faith means in light of relationship with our next door neighbors and in light of our relationship with people around the world. So it actually, faith is inherently political.
What do you think the relationship should be between people that are in the business of religion and politics? How often should they be talking about political issues?
Well, I'm a social historian, so I don't deal in normative issues, to be honest. But just to comment, you know, a little bit about Christians' involvement in politics. What I find interesting, Reg Bibby's done some work on this, is that when you look at youth, particularly evangelical and charismatic youth, their attitudes are very much in line with the rest of their generation.
Yeah, they've moved left too,
Yeah, they've shifted. So, I mean, this whole thing of, you know, liberal, conservative, and trying to align that with some sort of a religious affiliation, I don't think is working.
Same question to you.
I would say that interesting about the NDP was mentioned is that the NDP actually is the heir to a very long social gospel tradition,
Methodist,
especially in Western Canada. But they've moved now to a more secular, if you want to say they're less interested in, say, economic redistribution and so forth, and more interested in what you might call lifestyle, particular issues. There's a big shift in the NDP, and that reflects a shift in liberal Christianity towards those issues. Canada has been a bit unusual compared to other parts because religion has also been very regional and linguistic in this country, so there is always that political dimension. But I would say that religion is inherently political because it's about how we should order our life together. But within that, you can choose everything from the social credit to the CCF tradition, and then what issues are emphasized by religious people in politics. In Canada, we have, I would say, had a decline in the religious left, in their prominence in politics, which was part of our tradition. And now when we think about religion in politics, we tend to think about more conservative people. I think we'd be better off if we had stronger religious voices on it across the spectrum, but that's not the case at the moment.
And what's really interesting, just jumping in here, is with the NDP is that a lot of the people who are now, say they have no religion, come from mainline Protestant family backgrounds, right? So they were the United Church and the Anglican folks who were heavy into the social gospel movement. And so it's actually, it hasn't really changed in population, just that population has shifted their approach to religion, towards non-religion.
Okay, hold that thought. We're going to pick this up on the other side. Don't go away. I won't ask you to defend the United Church in its entirety. However, I would be remiss to not ask you about the United Church's position on Israel and the war. I mean, the United Church has famously supported divestment, has not recognized Israel as a Jewish state. And, you know, there's a new declaration from our friend, Reverend Dr. Andrew Bennett. He says, "We affirm that the Jewish people remain God's chosen people. The law and the covenants that God gave to the Jewish people, which we see as fulfilled in Christ, remain intact." Is this something that you would sign your name to?
I think one of the realities for the United Church of Canada is that we have tried to find ways, and not always successfully, of speaking for the most vulnerable. When we take a look at the realities of the violence that has been there and the reasons for it, the myriad of reasons for it, the task of the church has been for the healing and the wholeness of everyone. And we're going to disagree about how that gets lived out. We disagree within the context of the United Church, back and forth, about how best to speak into that reality. As a denomination, we believe that the violence needs to end, and that's a covering statement. We believe that everyone, Jewish, Israeli, Arab, everyone needs the ability to live in the fullness of who they are and the fullness of who they're called to be. And we pray that that's going to be possible.
Father,
I think it helps to have a bit of historical context, because otherwise it can become a bit of one-upmanship or one-downmanship, depending on which way you view it. Amongst conservative Christians, different denominations, conservative Christians, anti-Semitism, hostility to the state of Israel used to be a phenomenon more on the right. It used to be on the right. That shifted now, so you find people, by the way, Dr. Bennett is a colleague of mine at Cardis, so I know his work well. Now we've found, I said now maybe the last 25 years, is that on the Christian left, you find a kind of hostility to the state of Israel, sort of de facto, they're strong, therefore we're against them kind of attitude. And you've also had a growth in anti-Semitism, either in the Christian community or kind of adjacent to people in common political problems. So I think that's very lamentable, but it's there. It's useful, I think, to think about how more conservative Christians worked through their biblical, theological relations with the Jewish people and with the modern state of Israel to sort of expunge that kind of anti-Semitism or hostility, to sort of de facto hostility to Israel over, say, the last 75 years. But it's a particular challenge for the Christian left today, and it's a particular challenge, as my colleague mentions, in the United Church.
Do you believe that Christians have a religious obligation to back Israel?
You have to distinguish between the state of Israel, modern state of Israel, and biblical Israel, and you can't draw a continuity between the two. However, I think that if you're concerned about the welfare of the Jewish people, you have to be concerned about the welfare of the state of Israel. So I think you have to be defensive of their right to exist, not defensive, enthusiastic about their right to exist, with this caveat is that in Israel, amongst Jewish Israelis, which are the majority there, there's a lot of disagreement on what particular policy should be. So Christians outside Israel would have that same liberty. But yes, I think in general, if you're concerned about the Jewish people, you can't not be concerned about the state of Israel.
Okay, let's pause here. We'll be right back with more of the Zoomer. Welcome back to the Zoomer. It's time to turn the floor over to you, our audience. Gloria has the first question. Go ahead, Gloria.
Yes. Statistics show that there's a huge decline in Christianity. Now tell me, where do you see Christianity in the next 5 to 10 years?
Great question. Can I start? That's a great question. Thank you, Gloria. So Ryan mentioned earlier in the last census, the 2021 census, when StatsCan asked the question, what is your religion, if any, there's 53% of Canadians said that they were of some Christian tradition, right? And but in more recent surveys, what we've been seeing is that Christianity has now lost that majority. So I ran last year in 2023 the International Social Survey Program, which is a big survey with 2,000 adult Canadians, and only 44% said they were Christian. So in the last few years, we've seen, it's a change that's been coming for a while, but it's still a seismic shift of Christianity becoming a minority religion in the country, a big minority religion, but a minority religion. And so I think what's really fascinating is to now see how the various Christian traditions kind of adapt to that minority status, how it might change a bit. Maybe they become more political in some ways, because before, if you're a majority religion, you have to often accommodate big chunks of the population and maybe, you know, go on both sides politically. But maybe now that you're kind of a more minority phenomenon, you're willing to kind of be more active or vocal on certain political issues. But I mean, this is the big question next few years. I mean, Christianity is not disappearing from Canada anytime soon, not at all. But it is going to kind of have to adopt this new role in society in a way that now is kind of made kind of official in the statistics, if you will. We knew it was coming, but it's finally arrived, yeah.
Marissa, can I jump in there too?
Absolutely.
Because I think one of the things that, at least from a faith perspective, I need to be really careful about is that we've been hearing about the decline of Christianity for a very long time, and actually the death of Christianity has been something that's professed over and over and over again, and yet it keeps going. There's something in the message, and I'd like to say perhaps something with God having to.
Perhaps.
Well, okay, all right, I'll go further than that.
Why don't you say it's true?
Okay, it's true.
Hey, it's United Church, man.
God has something to do with this.
God has a lot to do with
Exactly.
it. Yes. And if you
Thank
think
you.
it's
I'm
true,
glad that my Catholic brother here is actually helping me with this. God,
Happy to be of service.
if we believe that God has something to do with this, which we do, then it has more to do with God than it has to do with us.
Correct.
So even with all the change that's happening, God is still working in the Christian communities in Canada and around the world.
Very good. So welcome, brother. That's
Thank
good. To Gloria's question, the church will be smaller numerically, but it'll be more faithful, because the engine of just cultural transmission, I'm a Catholic or I'm a Methodist or whatever because my grandfather was, that no longer conveys the faith. So people who choose to accept the faith is because of some personal conversion, which is not good for census numbers, but it's actually much better for the church.
All right. Okay. Gloria, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Harry, welcome to the round table. What's your question?
Thank you. My question has two parts to it. Is the Christian church doing anything to combat its decline in the West? And secondly, what is the Christian church doing to encourage its decline in the West?
To encourage it would be probably to rely on, if you want to say, that cultural transmission, that the momentum of the past, if you rely on that alone, that is no longer sufficient. So that would be encouraging it. And so a certain inertia is not in our favor, quote unquote, favor, the favor of the gospel. What is the church doing to combat it? I would say in the Catholic world, those pockets, and I'm not suggesting they're large numbers, but those pockets where there's vitality is a bold proclamation of the gospel, saying it's true, it was true in the time of Jesus, it's true today, and it offers a saving message to the people of today. And that finds a resonance, especially on campus, amongst younger people as well. It's numerically smaller, but it's, if you want to say, evangelically more vibrant. And it's not only the path, it's the only path we have, because we've got nothing else to offer aside from the gospel.
All right, Harry, thank you for your question. And before we go, I would love to get some final thoughts from each of my panelists. So we'll start to my left with Father de Souza.
The cultural impact of Christianity is diminished as compared to 50, 100 years ago. That's quite clear. But sometimes the cultural, or even more narrow, the political impact of Christianity is not a good measure of the fidelity of the church, which is really about conversion to Christ Jesus, and for other religions for their, if you want to say, analogous conversion. So it may be that amidst what are generally discouraging numbers, that there's an invitation there to return to what the church's initial mission is, which is the proclamation of the gospel. And so what I see today is you see, in an admirable way, young people in their early 20s, much more faithful, much more devout, much more committed, much more sacrificial than, say, my generation was 30 years ago. Now, and that's always the hope of the church. So that's where we're at.
The central message that I preach on a regular basis goes back to Jesus' great commandment. Love God with all that you are, Love your neighbor as you love yourself. On these two commandments hang everything written in law and the prophets, everything in life. I am seeing people live that over and over and over again. I'm seeing people within the secular contexts live that, and as you said, out of the experiences they had. I think as a church, we need to find ways of reconnecting people with their actions to the message of the gospel.
Well, if you go back to the 1950s and 1960s, people were in church because that was the thing to do. That's what you did on Sunday. And there was a lot of social pressure. If you weren't in church, people noticed, and you would be questioned on it. Today, people go to church because they want to. They've made that choice. Yeah. And so I think now when people say, I'm a member of whatever denomination, that has a saliency that it didn't have before.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two big trends driving our kind of changing religious landscape. I think they'll continue. I think it's good to account for them. You know, diversification of the different religious traditions. Christianity now has a bigger share of those born outside the country, 22% compared to in 1971. It was only 14%. And also other non-Christian faiths arriving, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, all growing. We're still relatively small in Canada, but growing. And also the other big trend is bigger chunks of younger generations being removed from all forms of organized religion. And these individuals now amongst younger birth cohorts, over 50% say they have no religion. 70+% don't attend religious activities on any regular basis. But they are still people who have, you know, who lead good lives, who have worldviews of their own, but even if they're removed from faith groups, and who have their own kind of sets of practices and beliefs. And for us in the academic world, that's a big new avenue of research is, okay, well, who are these non-religious people and what are they doing? Well, how do they think and how are they contributing to our society? Because they're now, over a third of the population.
All right, and we've covered some heavy topics today, but it was a conversation that needed to be had, so I appreciate your time and your candor, and that does it for us this evening. To get in touch, you can send us an email at comments@thezoomer.com. As always, a big thank you to my panel and to you at home. We'll see you next time.